Includovate Thought Series webinar. My name is Sonila David. I'm a principal researcher at Includovate based in the United States. And today we are going to be talking about a very important topic, the topic of inclusive governance. So I'm going to dare to define briefly what governance is. Governance is the way rules, norms, and actions are structured, sustained, regulated, and held accountable. Therefore, governance is inclusive when it effectively serves and engages all people, takes into account gender, disability, and other facets of personal identity. And when institutions, policies, processes, and services are accessible, accountable, and responsive to all members of society. So with that brief definition, you can see that inclusive governance is critical for all aspects of life, whether that means climate change, violence, natural resource management, etc. So today we are joined by a panel of experts on governance from Includovate. We have 3 panelists. And by the way, the session will last for approximately 1 hour. Unfortunately, one of our panelists is having problems, I believe, but maybe she'll join us later. So the first panelist we have is Girma Hundessa, who will be talking about pluralistic governance models to incorporate indigenous groups in global south. We have the second panelist, who is Kelemwa Zenebe, who will be talking about making government in low-income countries disability inclusive. What is needed and how do we get there? And then our third panelist is Priva Angandu, whose topic is inclusive transboundary and international governance, power inequities, and global representation fora. So what the process will be is each presenter will introduce themselves and speak for about 5 minutes. After the presentations, we'll have an open panel discussion where I'll be asking questions to the panelists. And of course, we invite participants to ask their questions. So without further ado, I will ask Girma to lead off the presentations. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. Really, I faced a problem to use PowerPoint, so I present from my paper. And my name is Girma Hundessa. My academic background is in social sciences. I did my master's degree in indigenous cultural studies. And I did my PhD in social anthropology. My research interest is in the area of governance. I like to see the society relation with regard to land. And I like to see how state-based intervention affect customary access to resources and the related social relations and organizations. So now I'm serving as an indigenous senior governor researcher at the Includovate. And when I come to governance, I see governance from pluralistic angle. And from pluralistic angle, as you already said, governance can be defined as a formal and informal institutions that shape how power is exercised in a society, how decisions taken, and how citizens have their say in the process of governing. And actually, this definition say informal and formal kind of governance. It fails to capture the hybrid governance in between the two, because in the course of interaction between formal and informal setting, we find also a hybrid kind of governance that regulate behavior or that regulate how we access to resources. We do have different perspective on governance. One is indigenous perspective, and indigenous governance is embedded in the social structure of a particular society, and it is context specific, place specific, according to this view. In general, in the global south, customary norms are widely at work to manage resources and to handle dispute of various kind. And in this regard, actually, I found a certain studies that say more than 80% of dispute cases are brought before the indigenous institution for dispute settlement and handled at that forum. So that is what is prevalent in the global south in general. But indigenous governance is also criticized for one thing, and one of the commonly identified weakness of the indigenous governance structure across different cultures is that it excludes women's participation in decision-making on different issues like economic justice, political, and beyond. For example, under Ethiopia's many indigenous governance structures, women are highly restricted from having access to resources and to take control over land. The other perspective is legal or state-centered perspective, and the tenet of legal centralism is that governance is only formal governance, which is run by the state institution. So this perspective doesn't consider customary governance as a governance structure. And this perspective considers customary norms as extra-legal, anti-peace, and anti-development that is to be effectively replaced by the state-based laws. So this perspective draws on formalization of property as a remedy for poverty alleviation, economic growth, and conflict resolution, particularly in the global south. And in this regard, we can't just really refer to De Soto's work, who just recommended that only formalization of property can bring the people of global south out of poverty and political as well as social chaoses. Criticism of centralism approach shows that it downplays norms, as I've already mentioned to you, that govern property relation among indigenous people in the global south. I can take my own example for that. I found that the state-driven land formalization that planned to bring about equality of gender, economic growth, and to reduce conflict ended up at contesting custom-based property governance rather than bringing its intended goals. And the other perspective, which is an inclusive kind, which is really pertinent to our discussion, is legal or institutional pluralism, which is at work largely in the global south. Because if we go for indigenous one, can we avoid state institution? No, we cannot. So both institutions exist in the same social and geographical field, and they operate side by side to govern resources and to handle conflict. Therefore, the notion of legal pluralism that there exists at least two governance in any society, whether in the global south or in the global north, and customary law, religious law, social relations, practices at the local level configure property relation and handle conflicts. And these institutions actually interact with each other in a number of ways, and the interaction could take contradictory, or it could take complementary nation or competitive one. In general, just I can say that in plural legal settings, people have choices. Agency works here. One can report his or her case at a certain setting for dispute settlement, and people can shop between institutions to get their dispute settled or to get their cases handled, and these have its own implication. It may have challenges or opportunities for the people in the global south. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Irma, for respecting time and giving us a very nice overview of your topic. I think we can now go to Kelemwa
Yes.
for her presentation. Kelemwa, could you adjust your camera a bit?
I don't know how to adjust actually.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Anyhow, you have about 5 minutes. You can introduce yourself briefly and then talk about your topic.
Okay, thank you. I'm Kalama from Ethiopia. I have a in gender studies from Addis Ababa University, and I have joined Includovate before 40 days. It's all about myself and proceeding to my presentation on making low-income governance disability inclusive and how to get it there. I have just few points to say. So my first point is inclusion is all about choice. Maybe when we exclude people based on their gender, race, disability, skin color, blah blah, it might not be well informed, but still, inclusion or exclusion is a choice. So, governance, whether it is structural or societal, it excludes um, people from different background who are thought to be minority, powerless. They cannot influence, they cannot manipulate the way governments, the three structures of government do towards their rights. So inclusion or exclusion is all about choice of governments choose to do or not to do. So for me, inclusive is profitable choice, whereas exclusion costs much. Though administrators, governors, and politicians claim inclusion to be costly, exclusion costs more than inclusion. Then who are the excluded groups, and what's the best to exclude, to ignore their rights? So exclusion may take place based on the identity of a given group, and if a given group is thought to be powerless to manipulate the way governments do things, then governance, whether it is structural or societal norm, it tends to ignore, to exclude people based on their power. For instance, in my case, persons with disabilities are about 1 billion in the world we are living in. Their number is huge, but still they are marginalized. Why? We can list some reasons. For instance, they are less educated, economically they are less powerful, so they may not manipulate political decisions and so on. So they are marginalized. Then what we should do to minimize such kind of exclusion, though every human being has the right to be excluded, to contribute and to benefit from the opportunities world is gaining. I have some points to say. The first one is using the numerical advantage as a way to influence the globe we are living in. For instance, as I have just said, persons with disabilities in the world are about 1 billion, and they are less educated, though there are many in number, but still we don't have means how to use our number to influence decisions which are made globally or nationally, specifically when we come to the low and middle income countries, as poverty and disability are much linked, because poverty aggravates disability and disability aggravates poverty. They are intertwined. So we cannot deny the prevalence of disability in the low and middle income countries. So we cannot say their number is low. Instead, paradoxically, their number is high, but still they are ignored. So how can we use our numerical advantage to manipulate political decisions in the future? For me, the first line stakeholders, persons with disabilities and their parents, as well as pro-disability allies, can take the advantage of the number of persons with disabilities to manipulate decisions made by governments. To mean, for instance, here in Ethiopia, then the sixth election is going to take place in the coming few months. So what can we do? Persons with disabilities in Ethiopia, who are about 15 million, can use our vote for political parties that have disability inclusive elements, disability inclusive agendas. We can use our number coupled with the votes of peoples who have positive attitude towards inclusion of disability to vote for the political party who that has the agenda to include persons with disabilities, because every political party is interested in winning the coming election. So we can take of this advantage as an urgent technique to bring the change concerning inclusion of persons with disabilities. So how we should get inclusion of persons with disabilities in the low and middle income countries must be aligned with the votes persons with disabilities have, because as I have just said, their number is high, they are not minor numerically, so we can take advantage of these points. And the other one is empowering persons with disabilities and ensuring their participation through education. If persons with disabilities, as far as persons with disabilities are less educated, they don't know how to be included in the governmental structure, and they don't know how to fight the widely held stereotype towards them. So we are expected to empower. When we say we, it refers to those of who could, it could be social science researchers, it could be individuals who are willing to take part in such interest groups and so on. We should take the steps that are taking place to empower persons with disabilities in order to secure their participation in the political arena. It could be taken in the form of quota or something else that can taken as affirmative action. The process of empowerment, participation, using the non-discriminatory laws and the accountable as well as transparent structures that assist inclusion of persons with disabilities, we should go for that. Thank you. This is what I have.
Thank you so much, Kelemua. Okay, so we now move on to our third panelist, who is Priva.
All right, thank you, Sonia. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. So, so my name is Priva Hangando. I am a principal researcher in governance at Includovate. And my background is public policy. I have a PhD in public policy from the University of Saskatchewan. I live here in Ottawa, where I work from. And I have even a broader background in political studies, in political science. I have a master's in political science, and my undergrad is also in political philosophy. So I'm very glad to be part of this conversation, and I fully endorse the micro level approach that my two colleagues have taken in terms of unpacking what inclusive governance is. Unfortunately, I don't have the luxury to dwell on the micro level. I'm going to take it up to the transboundary international governance scale. So one of the things that I do is to interrogate how policy, what you call policy diffusion, occurs, how international organizations and international players affect and influence policy processes to the national and subnational levels across different policy domains. So, and from that perspective, governance is the sharing of power. Like, Gemma said, power is very, very integral. It's an integral part of this conversation about governance. So it is how that power influences processes of decision-making and policies, subsequent policies. And as we know, policies determine how resources are distributed and who has access to what. So inclusive governance in this case, therefore, is both a condition and an outcome. It's a condition because it provides enablers. It allows different demographic, factors, different sectors of society to access what they need to be who they want to be. It's an outcome because if I'm getting a lot of feedback, if folks should just mute themselves. Thank you. Okay, so an outcome because then it is when you see a policy, you see yourself reflected in it. It's a product that makes every participant feel equal before a development process. If it's a policy, if it's education, if it's healthcare, then they see the outcomes that benefit them equally as they do everybody else. So it's a condition, and the factor of agency is very important. It's an outcome because everybody needs to benefit from the process. Now, at the international level, there are many theories of governance. Scholars and researchers have come up with various ways how the international society organizes itself. I'm just going to point to two and then speak specifically about what inclusive governance means at that scale. So one of those theories is what is called the democratic peace theory. And in that theory, scholars have argued that the international community organizes itself in a manner that is symmetrical, in a manner that power is shared symmetrically through multilateral institutions like the United Nations, and that nations cohere around the values and norms of equality. They participate, they belong to multilateral organizations, they sign treaties, they enter into treaty arrangements and share power and the subsequent benefits of that power sharing, whether it's economic, political, and otherwise. So there's a sense of symmetrical power relationship there. The second one is what is propounded by scholars who are called realists, who believe that actually multilateral institutions are not as innocent as they seem. That powerful nations manipulate these institutions, they wield a lot of power, they exert power over these institutions. For instance, the Bretton Woods, to realize their self-centered goals, national goals, their own objectives, and that these powerful nations, get the way out of these institutions. And an example would be, if you all remember, just a couple of years ago, or I think it was in 2018 or 19, when the United States, for instance, threatened to sanction countries that opposed its recognition of the status of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So there is a sense that the powerful one wants us to do as they wish and not as things ought to be. Okay, so what does inclusive governance mean in this kind of scenario? Three things that I would like to highlight here. The first thing is that at this transnational level, at this international transboundary level, inclusive governance means equality of membership in multilateral institutions. At the United Nations, every state has one vote. So that is very important. That equality means that everybody has an equal opportunity to influence the decision processes, the outcomes, whether it's through voting, or in discussing, even representation in various bodies of the United Nations. And we can discuss whether or not that is actually beyond that voting, if this equality is tokenistic or is actually embedded in all these institutions. And one of the biggest arguments that has arisen in that area is that that power structures in these multilateral institutions remains cleavage to their foundational power balances. For instance, who controls the IMF, who controls the World Bank, and everybody knows that the Bretton Woods have a huge control of the economies of the global South, but the control of these institutions is not in the global South. So we can discuss further about how we can find solutions, such looking into the future predictions in the coming parts of the conversation. The second point I would like to mention here is the balance in trade. Who benefits in global trade? So there are three factors here that I would like to highlight. The first one is that inclusive governance in trade should entail that that countries have autonomy in their own resources, in exploiting their own resources without undue influence from powerful nations. So who controls, minerals in Zambia? Who controls minerals in the Congo? Who controls agricultural production in Ivory Coast? Who controls the trade in cocoa? Who determines the value of cocoa? And who actually runs that resource that should be a benefit for the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or indeed Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, as you may wish to call them. The second point under the balance of trade is equal access to markets. Who has access to markets? And again, we discuss this further as we look at solutions. But at the global level, we must, inclusive governance means there must be some sense of equality to, to access to markets, so that poor nations have some benefits from that. And again, like I said, there will be more to discuss in the next part of the conversations in seeking solutions to that. And the third part of that is redistribution of wealth. Currently, we are the entire world is grappling with the COVID-19 situation. Poor nations, if you look at the mapping of the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines that are, being manufactured in the global north predominantly, there is almost you cannot even foresee when some countries are going to receive the COVID vaccines. Where I live here in Canada, my government has procured 5 times more than they need to vaccinate all of us living in this country. Some countries have not even had an iota of they have no idea how this is going to get to them. So that's redistribution in terms of resources. The final point I'd like to make here is equality before international law. And again, this is an ideal with a strong reputational fallacy. For instance, I'll give an example of the law of war prohibits the use of force, unless there's proven, it has been proved before the UN Security Council, or a nation has been attacked by its perceived adversary. Otherwise, use of force should not be an appeal, should not be a solution. But we've seen this violated many times, and that's just a simple example. There are many ways in which we can say, is international law equally applicable to all the countries to the benefit of the global community? And there's no, again, that's a big discussion in political science about, hegemonic power and who controls what. But, in an ideal world, when you're talking about inclusive governance, we want to see every state being subjected to the same laws for the equal benefit of all states involved. I'm going to leave it at that point, and then I'll, take it up from the few points I've raised for fleshing out in further detail as we get into further conversations. Thank you, Sonia. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Riva. Now we'll move into the open discussion part of our webinar today. And I have 3 questions that I'll pose one by one to all of the panelists. I mean, they will be open, so all of you or 1 or 2 of you may respond as needed. The first question is, what are the causes and consequences of exclusionary governance structures? So whoever would like to answer that or comment about that, please. Shall I repeat? What are the causes and consequences of exclusionary governance structures? I'm sure some of you have mentioned those some of those points already, But what happens, what are the consequences when we have exclusionary governance structures?
Well, I'm happy to continue the conversation if nobody is willing to jump in immediately or ready to jump in immediately. So there are many causes of exclusionary governance structures, and there are many consequences as well. But I think I'd like to dwell on just one factor about power. Power is such a big phenomenon in international governance, even in, even at the local level in terms of national governance, whether you're talking about distribution of power in a country that is multi-ethnic, whether you're talking about the sharing of power with different demographics, with persons with disability against those that have no disabilities, whether it's power between genders. So the wrestling for power, that desire for power, the desire to control the other, there's the concept of power to influence policy and power over another demographic sector. So that's a huge piece in unpacking what causes exclusionary governance, and that it explains corruption in systems that where one group of people wields so much or command so much wealth and riches and controls processes that deliver wealth and services like education and healthcare. Appointment into governance positions. So it's a whole concept of power that needs to be unpacked there. The consequences are many. Obviously, the first one is the inequitable distribution of resources, whether they're financial resources, access to services like healthcare and education, employment, other means of livelihood. But there are also other, aspects of or consequences to this, to exclusionary governance. Conflict is one of them. You cannot explain why conflict occurs in places like the Congo, or for instance, in Rwanda in 1994, the genocide in Rwanda, or indeed the racial conflict in the United States and in the global north, even in Canada here where I live, without understanding the concept of exclusionary government. It's a consequence, it's an outcome of power sharing, the power dynamics. So I think that is very important for us to understand that power, how it is distributed, how it is shared, and how it is even conceptualized has all these ripple effects in terms of consequences. And I will leave it for other colleagues to come in.
Okay, Priva, I have a question to you because as you are well experienced on the issue of governance, I would like to have just a clue from you, just based on your experience. That is, it makes sense if the US or European Union wishes to have superpower over African countries. Okay, it's nationalism, it's a rivalry. It makes sense, but what if, let me align all the cases with my own lived experience, and what if able persons discriminate persons with disabilities? How does it how does it make sense? What's the benefit of stereotyping, excluding persons with disabilities? Can we say it is an issue of power? Even the community is told, even the committee is, even advocacy, anti-stereotype against persons with disabilities are taking place. It is taking too longer to change the widely held community attitude towards persons with disabilities. And it could be the issue of this gender issue, men and women. What is the advantage of taking power over the other? This is my question for you.
Thanks, Kalimwa. So I appreciate that question, and it's a very good question indeed. One of the norms in inclusive governance is that inclusion is good not only for the material benefit that it delivers, because, okay, we are including everybody in society, women and people with disabilities, and then a country performs better economically. So that's a teleological outcome. It's obviously beneficial for everybody in society that there's inclusion, everybody's working together and everybody benefits equally. But beyond that, there's also the value of respect, the value of creating norms of equality. There's a concept of wrong and right. Okay, I don't think it's sufficient to explain the ill of exclusion based on material outcomes in terms of employment benefits, in terms of economic benefits, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's also important to understand that there's wrong and right. So it is wrong to not see the other as a human being. It is wrong to not treat a person with a disability as an equal. It is wrong to subject members of the LGBTI to to prison and to violence and to harm because they are different from you. So the concept of right and wrong is equally important as we talk about power. But I think you can still link it to power. This inherent desire to control the other is it's a very embedded attribute of human society, where white people, feel they need to control, non-whites, where rich people feel they need to manipulate the poor, where indigenous people are marginalized because if we include them, they become a threat to us. The concept of power is indeed still embedded in that structure. But I think it doesn't take away the fact that the concept of right and wrong is one of the integral aspects of the promotion. For instance, when you talk about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, I think the CRPD stresses the normative value of equality, that equality is a principle that must be realized, not because you're doing anybody a favor, but because human beings are equal beings. They are created equal, they're born equal, and therefore they must be accorded equal opportunities to realize their own goals and to dream and to decide who they want to be. So there is no advantage in marginalizing anybody, whether it's economically or otherwise. I think you reduce yourself even much more. You lose your own value when you look at others as less than who they are. So I think Kalemo, you're right, and I really appreciate your question. Thank you.
Thank you. My second question, you've already touched on some of it already, which is what are the benefits of inclusive governance structures? Yeah, let me just finish that before you go ahead. What are the benefits of inclusive governance structures and who benefits from it and how? So Girma, please go ahead. I know we've already started discussing that already. The other thing I would like to ask is the audience participants to please pose any questions you have in the question and answer. I think it's a chat box, and I will pose those questions to the panelists. So go ahead, Girma.
Thank you, Sony. Just to begin with the talk, just briefly to touch up on the causes and the consequences of exclusionary governance. Just I always like to cite a certain author named Paul. And he studied land issue in Southeast Asia, and he identified 4 mechanisms of power of exclusion. The people are excluded because of 4 important power reasons. And one is regulation. It could be state law, policies, or customary one, market, forces, capital. These are 4 powers of exclusion. So sources of exclusion could not only be embedded in the state law, but it can be associated with market, it can be associated with capital, it can be associated with money, network, and the like. A simple example is that someone, a woman who doesn't have money, cannot just go to justice institutions to report her land case. If she fails to do so, she is excluded. So exclusion has its own implications, consequences, which can be economic, social, political, and the like. To come to your second question, the benefits of inclusive governance are really are multiple, and primarily the disadvantaged group, mainly women and the disabled people, benefit from inclusionary governance system. In addition to this, individuals, family, community, the state, even the global society as a whole can benefit from inclusive governance structure. So I see the benefit of inclusive governance structure from holistic perspective. So it has its own economic advantage, it has its own social implication, social advantage. Let me take, for example, Ethiopia as an example. 30 years ago, before 30 years, 50% of the total population of the country were women. Still, they are women, but they were not allowed to access to education because of the bad state law, I can say, or the exclusionary system of system that is embedded in the social structure of the society. Whatever the reason, they were excluded from gaining access to education. And we left 50% of women behind because of these exclusionary governances. Now, just almost 25 years ago, the state formulated a policy called National Women Policy. And in that National Women Policy, women were allowed to just access education. In fact, they began to access education. And in relation to that, their economic empowerment and others were really augmented in the policy. And the policy has been implemented. And these policies somehow really improved women's access to education and related benefits. Better policies, generally what I can say, better policy allow women to be included in their country's affairs, participate in politics, economic, social, whatever. But I cannot conclude that it's not only the state law that allow people to benefit from certain things, but customary laws, social networks, and other means of access are also contribute to benefit from the things, the services.
Okay, thank you. I want to read one of the questions out. The question is, how can a government redistribute to the poor when the private sector and rich people have so much influence over governments? Does anybody have a response to that?
Sure. Okay, I can take that one. So so one of the most effective tools for wealth redistribution, and this works around the world, and it's a form that that presents itself as the most legitimate, if anything, is taxation. So when you tax your citizens, when you tax your population, you are getting money from them to redistribute that money through social services like education, which benefit everybody, including the poor, which like healthcare provision, which benefits every member of society. But that taxation can be structured in a manner that responds to the distribution of wealth in society. Sectors of society that earn less money could be bracketed in certain categories where they their taxation levels are proportionate to their levels of income. Businesses can be taxed in such a way that they pay a fair share of their earnings to the treasury for redistribution through social services for the benefit of everybody else in that society. So there are mechanisms of wealth redistributions that have been proven to work everywhere in the world to benefit the marginalized. But there are also other forms of redistribution, like welfare services. The value of social policy is primarily to serve as a mechanism for wealth redistribution. I'll give you an example. People who earn below a certain level of income in Canada, where I live, they get a
River, you are mute.
Sorry, have I been muted all this time?
No. We've been hearing you. Just suddenly went off.
Okay. So yeah, so I was just elaborating that there are mechanisms of wealth redistribution through taxation and through social service, social policy, like income supplements for less privileged members of society, that can actually ensure that wealth generated from a particular society is redistributed to the benefit of everybody else, without making those that work hard feel that working hard is a sin or is a wrong thing to do, but that national wealth is for the benefit of everybody in that society.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Sani.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so on my behalf, the ultimate goal of inclusive governance is enabling each and every citizen exercise one's human right to the fullest, irrespective of one's sex, ability versus disability, blah, 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 blah. So I think I have a question for Priva still. Look, for instance, in my country, Ethiopia, I pay 35% of my salary to government as a tax, income tax, but still we don't have disability sensitive transportation, social protection, and so on and so on. And such kind of realities create a feeling of dissatisfaction on my motherland, in me and the others, hopefully. So don't you think state nations can minimize dissatisfaction among their citizens by exercising inclusion? What do you say? I think satisfaction itself contributes for the fullest exercise of, for the fullest production of citizens. Because if I feel my motherland is doing something to me, then I am ready to contribute whatever I have in my mind, in my setting. But if nations refrain from securing my benefit, and if still nations refrain from enabling me contribute for my community, then how can I develop the sense of belongingness, whether it could be in Ethiopianism, even humanism? So national or global citizenship are mainly affected by exclusion and inclusion. So in either side, whether it's inclusion or exclusion, it affects the sense of belongingness, patriotism.
Okay, Sonia, do you want me to respond to that quickly?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you. So, and Kalemo, you're spot on. One of the challenges about taxation or wealth redistribution through taxation is a feeling of dissatisfaction by citizens when services are not delivered. And we know that a lot of countries are plagued by corruption, by extractive leadership, as it is called, as Acemoglu and Robinson calls it in that Why Nations Fail, a very a big book that that's being read currently, I think published in 2012. So inclusion, like we said at the very beginning, for it to be really to deliver the result that is intended, it must be participatory. Governance must be participatory. It must involve persons with disability, not only at the point of delivery, but from the very beginning of the conceptualization, the design of the policy. So, you know, the decision-making process, the coming up of the policy, the implementation of the policy, monitoring and evaluation of policies. So the policy cycle itself must be inclusive of all demographic factors of society for that policy to deliver equitably to members of that society. Even taxation is a policy instrument. So I agree with you that insofar as members of different diverse groups of society are not part and parcel of the whole process of decision-making of the policy design process, the outcome of that process is going to remain exclusive, it's going to be exclusionary and not benefiting everybody. There must be members of persons with disabilities representing themselves in parliament, represented at high-level decision-making areas, just like, you know, LGBT individuals must be part and process of the whole policy chain to determine their participation at the very end of, you know, to just not be at the receiving end of a policy outcome, but to have been part and part of the process. So agency is extremely important in inclusive governance. It's not just about doing a favor to a particular part of society by delivering a policy outcome. No, it is about participation from the very beginning of the policy process to the very end of the policy cycle, including evaluation, so that everybody feels they are integral part of the entire process. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Excellent. That leads to my third last question, which are what are your future predictions or future suggestions for strategies to make governance structures more inclusive at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level? Maybe Girma, you have some comment to make about that? I think Priva has started us off quite well to answer that question.
Just as I've already mentioned to you, we have two perspectives, particularly two dominant perspectives with regard to governance. One is legal centralism, and legal centralists say that law is only the law of the state, and the law is a law of the state, and that accommodate all category of people in a nation. That is their nation and their mission as well. So does this work out in the global south is a question. Can really the state law replace customary institutions and the customary law? That we are going to see only the state law in maybe the coming 10 years and beyond. For me, this doesn't work out. It doesn't work out. My view is that we do have multiple institutions that are operating at the local level. It could be religious law, it could be, you know, customary institutions and beyond. And they are interacting with the state law, and they are working with the state law. They are governing, you know, properties. They are handling peace, and they are still living together. We have almost counted a century that the state law is living together with the customary institution. That we cannot predict that the state law replace the customary institution in the future. So my perspective is more of legal pluralism, and I believe that legal pluralism is inclusive. Someone who is excluded from gaining access to resource at the state institution may gain access to resources at the customary settings. Sometimes, for example, we blame customary institution as exclusionary one. It excludes women, but this doesn't work out always. You find a case when or where, you know, customary institution accommodate women in its settings. So my view is that customary institution continue to live together with the state institution. Therefore, what is needed for me is consolidating pluralistic governance, cooperation between custom and the state law. incorporate indigenous people in the governance structure of the global south.
Thank you. Kelemua, can we hear from you as to what you would like to see going forward to improve inclusive governance?
Yeah, I think as I tried to mention during my presentation, I think the stakeholders themselves should take the first line to fight for their own rights, unless I think the systematic exclusion may take a bit longer to be replaced by inclusionary system. So the first line stakeholders and allies should start using what they have at their hand. It could be numerical advantage. It could be any form of manipulating how government do things. So I think we should change our approach, and we should have innovative forms to struggle against exclusionary systems, whether it's intentional or unintentional, whether it's structural or societal. The stakeholders themselves, voiceless themselves, should start fighting for themselves. That's what
There is a question that I'm going to read out. How do we empower the society to ask the right questions and influence government performance? For example, in legislation formulations that actually benefit the society. I don't know who can answer that question. How do we empower society to ask the right questions and influence government performance?
Shall I proceed?
Sure.
For me, education is the first key to empower people to know about their rights and to enable them act accordingly on the knowledge they have gained through education. So education is instrument. Actually, the course of education by itself may be influenced by different factors, but still, it's the first key to me.
Thank you so much. I just realized, despite the very interesting discussion, we have run out of time. So on that note, I would really like to thank all three of our panelists, as well as the participants for this very enjoyable panel discussion, and to wish you all a good day. Thank you very much. And we look forward to the next webinar by Includovate. Thank you so much, and bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.